Hi guys, I'm Larry, and this is the Old Gazer channel, which is all about amateur astronomy, and specifically it's intended for beginning or inexperienced amateur astronomers and is designed to provide some basic information, some practical information, and maybe a little bit of inspiration, to give you a sort of a leg up or to assist you in moving into this very wonderful but sometimes a challenging hobby. So that's what we're all about. If this is your first time watching, welcome. If you're returning after having watched earlier videos, welcome back. And with that, let's just get started with today's video. Today we're going to talk about something that I hope will be of great interest to you. We're going to be talking about the constellation Orion. Now, for those of us in the northern hemisphere during these winter months, Orion is one of the most prominent things in the night sky, a very recognizable constellation, and most people can find it right away, has some very obvious characteristics. And not only that, but the Orion constellation is a very rich area of the sky to find a lot of very interesting things to view, especially things that have to do with nebulae. And so what I thought we would do in this video is just kind of to give you a guided tour of the Orion constellation and the area around the Orion constellation, and discuss some of the wonderful things that are out there that are available for amateur astronomers to be amazed by and inspired by and educated by. And of course, this will be a simplified guided tour because this is Old Gazer and I do simple things, as I've said many times in the past. But I thought we would just take a little look at the Orion constellation and point out some of the many things that are available there for us to enjoy as we observe and image objects in the night sky. And then I thought at the end of the video we will use Stellarium, which is a free download for a computer, and you can also get a download of this for smartphones, I believe. I'm going to use Stellarium to simulate, if you will, what it would be like to go out and set up and view the Orion Nebula. So, overview of Orion, and then specifically we'll look at a simulation of finding and viewing and photographing the Orion Nebula. So that's what's on tap for today. The good news is that you've seen just about all of this that you're going to see in this video, and I'm sure you're elated about that. I wouldn't want to look at this for 20 or 30 minutes, and I'm sorry you have to. But we're going to do the rest of the video on a monitor. I'm going to get on my computer and we're going to pull up Stellarium, and we're going to use that as we go on a guided tour, and then as we simulate what it might be like to go out and find and view and image the Orion Nebula within the Orion constellation. So I'll be with you as soon as I get that set up and get ready to go. All right, here is the Orion constellation right in the center of the screen here. This is how it appears at about 10 o'clock in the evening, looking towards the south from where I live, from my current location, in roughly, the middle of January or so. Very beautiful, very rich part of the sky, and the constellation just absolutely unmistakable. Pardon me. Very beautiful, very splendorous in the sky, very commanding. The constellation is readily identifiable in several ways. First of all, it has a distinct hourglass shape, with one side being there and the other side being roughly like that. It also can be easily identified by a rough rectangle with these four stars here at the corners. Of course, it has the very noticeable 3 stars and a straight line here, which represent the belt of Orion the Hunter, and hanging from that belt right here are a series of stars that represent the sword of Orion. So those are just some easy ways that the constellation can be identified. Very easy to find. There it is, just kind of begging to be noticed, hanging there in the night sky. Let's take a look at, put some lines in for the constellations so you can kind of see the full extent of the constellation. It begins up here and of course comes down through this area here and out to here. So you can see you know, the extent of the constellation and how that relates to other constellations in the vicinity. If you just look at this, you would be tempted to think, since this constellation represents Orion the Hunter from mythology, this is probably a bow out here. Actually, that's not the case. Let's take a look at a classic representation of a drawing that might represent what the people thought they saw way back when they looked up into the sky and thought that they saw a depiction or a representation of Orion the Hunter from mythology up there. So let's just add a drawing here. And there you can see how it has been depicted classically down through the years. What seemed to have been a bow is actually represented as an animal skin hanging over Orion's arm out here. He is, of course, wielding a club, and here's his belt with the sword in its sheath hanging from the belt. The 4 stars at the corners of the rectangle represent the shoulders and 1 knee and the foot of Orion the Hunter. So that gives you, you know, the classical interpretation of how people probably saw this group of stars and how they came to think it represented, was a good representation of that mythological figure. Let's take those things away now and get back to the normal view of the constellation. And let's talk a little bit about some of the wonders that are available for us to view within this beautiful constellation. And let's start out with stars. Let's talk about some of the stars within this constellation. I'm going to imagine that we've got a telescope here, maybe a zoom eyepiece in that telescope, and we're going to zoom in a little bit so we can see this a little bit better. Okay, this star right here is obviously a reddish in color. It's Betelgeuse. And it is one of the 10 or so brightest stars in the sky. It's a variable star, so it's brighter at some times than it is other times, but I think the general consensus is that it's somewhere around one of the 10 or so brightest stars in the sky, more or less. It's an extremely large star, many times larger than our sun. It's a red giant, or maybe sometimes called a red supergiant. And it's an old star nearing the end of its life. And astronomers believe that sometime within the next 100,000 years or so, this star will probably go supernova. And when that happens, there are indications that it might appear for a while in the night sky as being as bright or even brighter than the full moon. So if you happen to be around when that happens, you might have a chance to see a truly spectacular sight coming from the region of the Orion constellation. Diagonally at the other corner of the constellation, you have the very bright star Rigel, which is among the 6 or 7 so brightest stars in the sky. Down here in this corner is Safe. And diagonally across from that at the final corner of the rectangle is the star Bellatrix. There are many double stars within the Orion constellation, and a lot of amateur astronomers enjoy trying to find those double stars and trying to resolve as many of those with their amateur telescopes as they can. But this is a very rich area for finding and resolving double stars. There are also some multiple star systems somewhere near the vicinity of Orion's belt here. One of these has, I believe, 5 stars in the system, and the other has either 3 or 4. I can't recall offhand, but it can be interesting to try to find those in your telescope and see how many of the stars within those multiple star systems that you can resolve. So there are some star clusters within the Orion Nebula, the Orion constellation. Most of these are open star clusters, and most of them very faint. Many of them actually beyond the reach of amateur telescopes, but very few of them you might be able to find and resolve, and that'd be an interesting task to see if you can find some of the star clusters within the constellation. Okay, let's go now to, we've talked about stars, double stars, star clusters, those kinds of things. Let's talk about now the things that Orion, the constellation Orion, is probably most noted for, and that would be the very familiar, very beautiful nebulae that exist within the area defined by this constellation. Now let's back out just a little bit here. If you look up into the sky and look at the constellation, it will appear that the belt, the sword of Orion, rather, you can see 3 stars that represent the sword of Orion here. Actually, one of those is not a star at all. The center one is actually the famous Orion Nebula. So let's zoom in a little bit to get a better look at that. And here you can see the Orion Nebula. It's designated M42 in the Messier catalog, and is one of the brightest and easiest to find of the deep sky objects. And if you're interested in starting to observe and especially to image deep sky objects, this is probably the best possible place to start, because this nebula is so easy to find, and it's bright and easy to view and to image, relatively speaking, compared to most deep sky objects. Very beautiful, as you can see here. There is another nebula that is actually part of what we're seeing right here. It's referred to as M43. Some people believe that it should be recognized as a distinct, separate nebula. Others believe that it's actually just part of the M42 nebula, which is just separated by a dark streak of dust or whatever. But at any rate, there are 2 separate designations in the Messier catalog, M42 and M43, and they're all within this realm right here. Just above the Orion Nebula is another nebula known as the Running Man Nebula. So called because if you look at it in just the right way, you can see what appears to be the image of a man running across the cosmos, the Running Man Nebula. Very interesting to see and view and observe as well. Just a short distance further on, you will find 2 more of the more famous nebulae, and the most viewed nebulae, and these would be the Flame Nebula and, of course, the famous Horsehead Nebula, which you can see right there, a dark nebula that has the unmistakable shape of a horse's head. That can be a little bit difficult to view and to image. It requires some pretty dark skies and some pretty good aperture to do so, but it is within the range of many amateur telescopes and is very much worth investigating. If you move on further, you can find some more nebulae. This one right here is M78. Let's zoom in a little bit. It is, I believe, the brightest of all the reflection nebula that have yet been discovered. And it glows so brightly primarily because it's reflecting the light of these 2 very bright stars right here. So a very beautiful nebula, a reflection nebula, worth investigating to see if you can view and perhaps image that one as well. There are others. You can see all this nebulosity out here. There are some many smaller nebula within the constellation. Many of them are actually very faint. They have magnitudes of 10 or greater, up to 14 or more, and some of those are frankly beyond the reach of most amateur telescopes, but it might be an interesting challenge to see how many of these other smaller nebulae that you can find as you look within the general area of the Orion constellation. So that gives you a very high-level, simplified overview of the constellation itself and some of the wonderful things that you can find within the area of the sky defined by this constellation. You can spend many wonderful hours out there being amazed and inspired and educated by the stars, the star cluster, the nebulae, and just the overall constellation itself. Very splendorous part of the sky, and that's why I titled this video Splendor in the Skies. The very wonderful, the very beautiful, the very rich, the very amazing Orion constellation. Now let's do a very quick simulation of looking at the Orion Nebula through a telescope. Let's just pretend that we're going out to a viewing site and that we're going to try to view and maybe take a picture of the Orion Nebula. to keep this thing short and prevent it from getting out of hand, we're just going to do one simulation. Let's say that we're going to go out there and we're going to be using an 80 millimeter refracting telescope with a focal length of 400 millimeters. And let's say that we're first going to try to look at the Orion Nebula using a 24 millimeter eyepiece that has a 68-degree field of view. So that will be the equipment that we're going to pretend that we're using here. And then after we've seen what that's going to look like through the eyepiece, we will simulate attaching my DSLR camera to that telescope and looking to see what a photograph might look like taken through that 80 millimeter refracting telescope. So we'll just do that very briefly and just to give you an idea of what that process might be all about and what it might look like. Here, of course, is the Orion constellation on the screen. If we zoom in here, we can find, we're pretending that we're using our finder scope here to help us find the Orion Nebula, which of course is right here. So let's say that we have now found it, that we've got our telescope positioned so that the Orion Nebula is in our field of view. And now we're going to see what that's going to look like if we look at it through that 80 millimeter telescope with a 24 millimeter eyepiece having a 68-degree field of view. And there's the view that we would expect to get. It's a pretty decent view, as you can see there. You can see the Orion Nebulas, M42 and M43, and the Running Man Nebula right here. So a pretty decent view. Now, one thing that we need to do is to keep in mind that this the default settings for the program we're using here, the app we're using, Stellarium, assume that you're in a Bortle 2 zone. I'm not in a Bortle 2 zone here. I'm in a Bortle 5 zone, and that is made even more of an issue because the direction that I'm going to be looking in here when I attempt to view or image Orion is going to be to the south. And that happens to be where the biggest dome of sky glow from light pollution exists because there's a big metropolitan area that lies fairly close by in that direction. So the sky will not look like this, unfortunately. There won't be that many stars in the picture. It won't be this bright and it won't be that good, but at least that gives you an idea of what you might expect to see within the eyepiece if you look at the Orion Nebula with a small refracting telescope and a 24 millimeter eyepiece. Suppose I want to take a picture of the Orion Nebula using my Nikon D3100 DSLR camera and that same 80 millimeter refracting telescope. I would of course remove the eyepiece and the star diagonal from the telescope. I would use a T-adapter and a T-ring to attach my camera to the telescope, and we'll talk about more in detail about how you do that in a future video. But now let's pretend that we've got the camera attached to the telescope and we want to see what kind of picture that we might expect to get if we took a photograph of the Orion Nebula. Now please keep in mind that what you're going to see here is not what you would see if you take a single exposure photograph of the Orion Nebula. You won't collect enough signal, enough light doing that to see the kind of detail that we're going to see here in a minute. You'd have to take multiple pictures, multiple long exposure pictures, and then integrate or stack those together in special software so that you could accumulate enough detail and eliminate enough noise to get something approaching what we're about to see here. Just wanted to keep that in mind. Again, we'll cover all of this stuff about taking pictures of deep sky objects in future videos, but let's assuming that we that we know all of that and we're going to take a picture of the Orion Nebula. We just want to look here or simulate what that's going to look like in the picture that we might take using this DSLR and this 80 millimeter refracting telescope. And here is what you would expect to see. Within the red rectangle there is going to be what your camera sensor is going to see. And with proper exposure, with a proper amount of detail and a reduction of noise, this is, as you can see, that's framed pretty well. That's a decent picture. You can see the entire nebula pretty much. Also can see the Running Man Nebula with a nice background around it. And so that just gives you an indication of what you could get by taking a photograph using a DSLR and an 80 millimeter refracting telescope. So I hope that was an interesting little simulation. With that, let's wrap this one up. Hope this has been meaningful to you. Hope this has been a little bit inspirational. Hope it's made you eager to get out there and explore the Orion constellation. And I'll be back soon with another video. Until then, let me just close by thanking you so much for watching. And as always, my wish for you is that you might have clear skies and good viewing.